the the section we're on, the unit in the book on support and movement, includes the skin, which I just talked about, and then goes on to look at the skeleton and then eventually the muscles. The way that this is set up, the second chapter in this unit, called Bone Tissue and the Skeletal System, is the introduction, sort of talks about what bones are and how they grow mostly, and what that means for the skeleton. And then the next two sections, two chapters, chapters 3 and 4 in this unit, are the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. When we talk about the skeleton, we separate it into different regions. Axial just means with the body axis. So that's going to be the trunk and the head. So the axial skeleton is the skull, vertebral column, and rib cage. And then appendicular is referring to the appendages, or your arms and legs. So it's the bones of that, including where they attach. So along with the arm are the shoulder bones, and along with the leg is the pelvis, or the hip bones. So they're laid out there. As far as the lecture lab kind of approach to this course is concerned, the first chapter, the bone tissue chapter, is the one that you have the assignments for. So bones part 1, 2, 3, and 4 are assignments based on that chapter. The other two chapters are essentially the lab book component. So this is just showing you what the bones are, what they look like, where they are, that kind of thing. And if we were using a lab manual for this course, we would ignore those chapters in the book, and we look at the equivalent stuff in the lab manual. But we'll just be using this for the lab material here. So there are not part 1, 2, 3, and 4 and assignments about these two chapters. Those are just the reference material for the bones. And when we get to talking about the bones, I'll explain that a bit more. So I want to talk, hopefully somewhat briefly, about the bone chapter, just to introduce the skeleton a little bit. And then also, the main point of this chapter is to talk about how bones grow. And so I'll reference that a little bit. So the first section just functions of the skeletal system, just talking about various things that it does: protection, support. It's the basis for movement. It's where we store a major mineral, namely calcium, and energy storage in the sense that there's fatty tissue in bones, and then hematopoiesis means production of blood cells. Production of blood cells takes place in the red bone marrow. And this picture here shows the head of the femur, which is your thigh bone, with the red bone marrow evident in it. Right in the center of this, a little bit of a yellow spot in the middle, and if you read the labels here, that'd point to yellow marrow. Red bone marrow is where blood cells are made, and it's red because primarily it's making red blood cells, although white blood cells and platelets are made there also. Yellow bone marrow is adipose tissue, and so that's really what this is referring to as energy storage. So filling the space in bones, there's bone marrow. The red stuff is making cells for the blood. The yellow stuff is adipose tissue, which therefore is a storage form of energy-rich molecules. And then again, the bone matrix itself, which I talked about last time, is a calcium phosphate crystal structure. And so the minerals are stored in the bone matrix there. I just went quickly over the support, movement, protection stuff. it just seems like that's almost self-evident when we think about this, the skeleton. Just, it's the structure of your body. It's when you move, you're moving your bones. The movement itself is actually the function of muscles, which is a later unit in the course, but they move the bones relative to each other. And then they help to protect structures. Here they show the skull with the brain superimposed on it, suggesting the cranial cavity and protection for that organ there. But we can also think about the rib cage as protecting organs in the thoracic cavity, that sort of thing. Now, bone classification, I don't think is actually important, but it's useful to talk about so that you can understand sort of where we're going to be going with bones in a little bit. I'm not going to ask you necessarily to classify a bone as one type or another. I just want to explain what the classifications are referring to. The main type of bone that we're going to think of, our usual go-to example of a bone, is what we call a long bone. And long bones are not necessarily long as far as we can measure it. The bones in your toes are long bones by this classification. They're, of course, not long in a sense of measure, but they fall into this classification. What makes something a long bone is that it has two ends called heads, which flare out a little bit from the main shaft or body of the bone. So whatever size it might be, just an arrangement of the bone like that classifies it as a long bone. And we'll talk about that structure a little bit more later as we talk about the structure of bones as organs. So calling a long bone isn't talking about its absolute length. There are very, very short long bones, like those in the individual segments of your toes, for instance. As opposed to a long bone, the next type of classification one is a short bone. And this, again, is not about their length. What characterizes short bones is they have a fairly cuboidal type shape, meaning that they're kind of the shape of a six-sided die or something like that, as in rolling dice. What's important about short bones is they have flat surfaces, and that's how they interact with each other. So they're showing us the bones of the ankle. So these three bones, for instance, are kind of all side by side with each other. And when you walk, one bone slides across the surface of the other bone. And when we talk about joints after the practical next week, I'll address that kind of movement a little bit more. But short bones are mostly characterized by being very blocky in structure, and they have flat surfaces where they interact with neighboring bones. Again, it's not about their absolute length that we classify them as short. They're, in fact, some bones that are classified as short bones that are, in fact, bigger than some bones that are classified as long bones. Okay, it's just, it's a shape thing. Long bones have flared out ends with a shaft down the middle, and short bones are very blocky in structure. That's what really tells them apart. The next type of bone is the flat bone. The example they're giving here is the sternum, or your breastbone, which I always kind of visualize as looking like a tie. So where the knot of the tie is, and it comes down to a point. Hanging right there, you can think of it. Being a very narrow bone, this as an example of a flat bone doesn't provide a very important aspect of flat bones, which is that they're not actually flat. Or another way I like to say this, which always kind of baffles students, is they're not flat like a pancake, they're flat like Kansas. Anybody know what I mean by saying that?
Well, Kansas is topography. There's no like large landscapes or mountains or anything.
But what is there about Kansas?
Wide open spaces.
Well, yeah, but let's say you start on one side of Kansas and you're going to go to the other side, and you see the other side of Kansas from where you're standing.
No.
Why?
It's bigger.
Because there's a curvature to the earth. Okay? Flat bones have curvature to them. Okay? Pancakes you can see from one side of a pancake to the other. I suppose if you had a pancake the size of Kansas, because it would therefore have to be on the surface of the planet, would also have some curvature to it. But the idea is that flat bones actually do curve. The sternum does curve. It's just very hard to see because of its dimensions. The ribs are another example of a flat bone. And you can definitely see that there's a curve to this. So here's a rib. If you were to cut through a flat bone in cross section, you'd see the same sort of structure that we see all the time, and we'll see a picture of it later on. We look at different type of flat bone. But, so we cut in cross section like this. The bone, however, curves quite a bit in its more longitudinal direction. Another very good example of a flat bone are the cranial bones in the skull. And those definitely have curvature to them also, because they're making up the curved structure of your head. But again, if we look at those in cross section, they're going to have the same basic structure as any other long bone. And in fact, not long bone, flat bone. But in fact, the pictures of cross sections of flat bones that we have are actually in reference to the cranial bones. That's the ones that we pay the most attention to. And then the fourth type is what we call an irregular bone. And really what irregular means is that it's not one of those other three. Okay? So the go-to example all the time is the vertebral bone that we have here. It has characteristics of the other types of bone to some extent. The body of a vertebral bone has a flat surface here where it basically interacts with the next bone in the column, which is very much like a short bone. Or especially here in the spinous process sticking out the back, it comes to be very flat, and we could cut a cross section of that and see the same sort of thing. Now, long bones are long bones mostly because of their overall shape, and irregular bones don't have that kind of overall shape, so we can't really match that. But irregular is kind of the catch-all for anything that isn't one of these other three types of shapes. Now, there is a fifth shape that's listed here, and you could kind of say that it's like an irregular bone because it's just a weird shape. But what's more important about this type of bone is how it develops, which is different from any other bone. This is what's called a sesamoid bone, which refers to the fact that it kind of looks like a sesame seed, which is a bit of a stretch when you actually think about the kneecap. But you can kind of imagine what they're getting at there. What's important about sesamoid bones is they develop differently from any other bones. Now, one of the things I want to stress in this chapter is how bones grow. So we'll look at how the other bones grow. But what sesamoid bones do is they develop out of other soft tissues. So the kneecap, the patella, for instance, is a calcification of the tendon that connects the quadriceps in your thigh to the tibia, which is your shin bone. Early in development, fetal development, there's not a bone there, and it develops out of the tendon that connects that muscle to the shin bone. So that's very unusual. There are a couple of other places where bones form that way, but the patella is the main example that everybody has. Some people have sesamoid bones in weird places that nobody else has. And that's just because of how things work. I don't know if this is at all a real example, but just to suggest, there might be some tendon-like tissue going along the side of your hand connecting to your pinky finger, let's say. So it's part of being able to move your pinky finger this direction. Go with me on this one. For some people, there might be a spot, say right here next to this joint, where that tendon gets calcified and another bone will develop. And it's not exactly a bone spur, but there might be a little sesamoid bone that forms for some people right there because of how they use their hand. It's not going to happen for everybody. For everybody, the patella forms in that tendon like that, but there are some other places that sesamoid bones can form out of soft tissue in a different way. But the patella is the one main one. So that's kind of separate from all these other types because of how it develops. And of these other types, we have long, short, and flat bones, and then everything else is just considered irregular. Some things that really should be considered irregular sometimes get thought of more as flat or short or something like that because they're mostly like that. But in the end, they're not. A good example of that is the pelvic bone. The big wing off to the side of the pelvic bone here is very much like a flat bone. But really, if you look at the whole thing, there are some aspects to it that do not let it be classified as flat. But some sources will actually call this bone a flat bone because the majority of it is kind of a flat bone. But really, most correctly, we'd call it an irregular bone. So those are different types of bones. I don't think classification's that important. I mean, classification is something that's important in anatomy in general, but bone classification isn't that important in and of itself. It's just important to talk about it because how the different types of bones grow is important and how they interact when we get to talking about joints. So it's useful to understand this, but I'm not going to ask you to classify bones based on this scheme at all. I just want you to have heard these terms. So it just talks about the different types there. The next section is about bone structure. And here's the first reason why I want to talk about bone classification, because the example of bone structure is a long bone. We always talk about bone structure looking at a long bone. This is the femur. The bracket up at this end points out the head here. Let me enlarge this picture. So the head here is sort of bracketed, and the head down here is kind of bracketed. Head is sort of the common term for that, but we actually call that an epiphysis. So there are two epiphyses. The one closer to the body being the proximal epiphysis, which for the femur or thigh bone would be at the hip joint. And then the distal epiphysis would be at the knee joint. And then the shaft between the two is referred to as the diaphysis. Some sources will only talk about those structures, the long diaphysis in the middle and the epiphyses on either end. In between these two, this bracket here and this bracket here, both labeled metaphysis, which is sort of the transition from the diaphysis to the epiphysis. And some sources will kind of leave that out because, again, it's really more of a transition. Now, the diaphysis is mostly made up of a thick, compact bone wall that's hollow in the center, which is usually filled with yellow bone marrow. That hollow center will taper off and get, here it's rather abrupt for the sake of how they've drawn this picture, but other sources, other pictures you might see that it comes to more of a conical tapering off in here. However that might be, where it's transitioning from the diaphysis to the epiphysis, that region is going to be called the metaphysis. And some sources will leave that out, just saying we got the epiphysis and we got the diaphysis. And the border between is kind of indistinct. One thing that is important about the metaphysis is this line that we see right here. This is called the epiphyseal line, which is another reason why some sources just use epiphysis up here. But
It's the real border between the epiphysis and what was the diaphysis. Except that we don't see real diaphysis looking structure distal to that. It still kind of looks like the epiphysis, because the epiphysis is pretty much all spongy bone. And we see that spongy bone still here in the metaphysis. The line in between here, that's where the bone grew longer. So if you didn't know this, when people are born, they're a lot shorter than when they're adults. Okay. And part of growing up is the bone getting longer, and that actually is happening right here, what we call the growth plate, more commonly. When it finishes growing, will harden into a line of bone that we can see right here called the epiphyseal line. And so where that growth takes place is within the metaphysis region of the bone. It's another reason why it's useful to point that region out. Now, the epiphysis or the metaphysis, as it may be, is mostly spongy bone, but then it has a very thin outer covering of compact bone, giving it a smooth outer surface. The spongy bone is lighter than compact bone, so since most of what makes up the bone here is either spongy bone or even empty space in the diaphysis, bones are lighter than they would be if they're just solid bone tissue. Okay. But we do need something filling in the space of the epiphysis, so we have spongy bone there rather than the empty space in the diaphysis there. Now, we always look at the bone structure with the long bone as an example because they have the most particular regions, the epiphyses and diaphyses. All other bones are essentially what we see in the epiphysis of a long bone. Now, we don't call them epiphyses, they're just bones, but they have a thin, compact bone outer shell, making them smooth on the outside, and the inside is pretty much all spongy bone. So whether we're talking about short bones or flat bones or irregular bones or sesamoid bones, they all look like that. Long bones are different because the shaft of a long bone is what we see here. No other bone has that kind of structure. And the point of that in the long bone is it helps bear weight. So long bones are generally going to be weight-bearing bones. There are many exceptions to that. But if you think about the major bones of the leg and the arm, we don't bear weight on our arms necessarily, but they come from that lineage of four-legged animals. So those are long bones and they bear the weight of the body. We have long bones in other places that don't exactly bear weight of the body, but they still have to deal with quite a bit of stress. And some of those are in your toes and fingers. So they have diaphyses also, and there's a couple of other places we have them. But other than long bones, everything else just looks like this. Just spongy bone with a shell of compact bone on the outside. If we look more closely at the structure of the bone before we get to the actual tissue, well, as we're moving in the thing about the tissues, the outer surface of the bone is covered in soft tissue. There's a dense, irregular connective tissue layer called the periosteum. It's really the attachment point for tendons and that sort of thing. And tendons are dense, regular connective tissue. Periosteum is dense, irregular connective tissue. But really, where a tendon's connected to the bone, the periosteum and the tendon are one continuous piece of tissue. Beneath the periosteum, we get into actual bone tissue. And if we're in the diaphysis of a bone, the wall is going to be compact bone tissue. And in the epiphysis, there's going to be a thin, compact bone outside, but it's mostly spongy bone inside. Bone tissue has a few different types of cells, and they all have osteo in their name. Osteo is just the Greek root that means bone. The first type is called an osteogenic cell, which actually is not
the most common name for it, but it's sort of the stem cell for bone cells. It gives rise to other bone cells. It's the progenitor of bone, which is where osteogenic comes from. In this picture, what they're pointing out as the osteogenic cell here is hard to distinguish in the way that they've drawn the picture from osteoblasts. And while I said some sources don't refer to osteogenic cells, it's because some sources just call them all osteoblasts. And really, osteogenic cell and osteoblast as names don't mean anything terribly different. Osteoblast means bone stem cell. The thing is that osteoblasts have a very important function, which osteogenic cells don't necessarily have, but they're kind of related. What osteoblasts do is they make bone matrix. They secrete proteins which incorporate calcium phosphate crystals into them and form that solid bone matrix. We always see osteoblasts on the outside edge of bone tissue. So here we're looking at the outside edge of part of a spongy bone spicule. There's also going to be osteoblasts, or the book will probably call them osteogenic cells, on the outside surface of compact bone tissue. Always on the outside. They're building the bone out. When the bone matrix forms around an osteoblast, the osteoblast then matures into what we call an osteocyte. So in the middle of the bone matrix, any cells that we see are osteocytes. And those are here in the compact bone tissue here, we see an osteocyte sort of sandwiched between layers of bone matrix. But we can see them here, again, sort of sandwiched between layers. Once the bone matrix is formed, there needs to be cells there to help maintain that tissue. They'll continue secreting proteins to maintain the health of the bone matrix, keep the calcium structure strong, and that sort of thing in there. The osteogenic cells, the osteoblasts and the osteocytes, kind of represent a family tree. Osteogenic cells are the early precursors that become osteoblasts. And then when osteoblasts finally mature, they're osteocytes. Osteocytes don't become osteoblasts again in the future, sort of the end point. Sort of like the grandfather cell, the parent cell, and the offspring cell. They just go in that order. The osteogenic cell is a little bit more important when we're talking about the initial growth of bones. So a lot of sources won't refer to them in mature bones because there really aren't that many of them. And anything that an osteogenic cell would do in a mature bone, osteoblasts would do just as well. There's a fourth type of cell that has osteo in its name. That's what's called an osteoclast. Osteoclasts are separate from the other three types of cells. Osteogenic cells give rise to osteoblasts, which eventually mature into osteocytes. They're all related to each other. Osteoblasts are completely different cells. They're actually, it's been discovered somewhat recently, that they're related to white blood cells. What osteoclasts do is they break down bone matrix. So osteoblasts make bone matrix and osteoclasts break it down. The mineral storage aspect of bone function is only useful if, while we can store stuff in the bone, we can also take it out. So osteoblasts store the calcium, osteoclasts release it when we need it. And they kind of play two sides of that process. What's unusual about the picture of the osteoclast that you see there?
Multiple nuclei.
Right, it has a bunch of nuclei in it. How many nuclei should a cell have? Should only have one.
There are some cells that have multiple nuclei, and when we see a multinucleated cell, what that means is it is multiple cells that have fused together. Okay, so the nuclei there are all remnants of individual cells. So in that picture there, we could say 6 cells all merged together to make up that osteoclast. And that's probably how they form. White blood cells of some sort fuse together and become osteoclasts. I don't know a whole lot about the development of osteoclasts. I just know that sometime in the last few decades, it was discovered that they are actually related to white blood cells. But exactly how they come to be, I can't say for sure. Being related to white blood cells actually is important because they have, you can kind of see in this picture, sort of a fringe where they interact with the bone matrix, and like a white blood cell acts like sort of a vacuum cleaner, cleaning up debris in your blood or whatever other tissues. Osteoclasts kind of gobble up bone matrix and break it down. So they work in a very similar way to a certain type of white blood cell. And we'll see a lot of osteoblasts. In fact, what are just labeled as the endosteum here, these are probably also osteoblasts. They just didn't color them in so they don't stand out. But the edge of bone tissue is just going to be covered in osteoblasts, which will help to make more bone matrix when it's needed. There will be a few osteoclasts here and there. They're very mobile, just like white blood cells. So that one there could crawl all over that little piece of bone if it needs to break down bone matrix anywhere around there. So those are the different types of cells that are found in bone tissue. Osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, and osteocytes are all interrelated, and the order I just gave them to you, osteogenic, osteoblast, osteocyte, sort of the progression through development there. And then osteoclasts are separate and help to break down bone matrix. This is a picture that shows flat bone, and like I said earlier, we're actually going to be looking at an example of this in the cranial bone, which in fact this picture is suggesting. Flat bone isn't terribly different from what I already told you about the structure of bone. Like I said, except for long bones, all bones are basically just spongy bone with a thin, compact bone outer covering, and that's what we see here. It's just that being flat, it extends off in either direction quite a bit. It has periosteum on the outside surfaces, both for the cranium, the outer surface of your skull, and the inner surface of the cranial cavity. There's no space in the middle like with the diaphysis of the long bone, so there's just the periosteum on either side. In this figure, in a lot of A&P books, when they're talking about the spongy bone and flat bones, they'll introduce, and it's in parentheses here, this weird word which is an alternate name for the spongy bone and flat bones. I think it's pronounced diploe, but I'm not sure, and the fact that I don't know how to pronounce it tells you that it's not a terribly important word as far as I'm concerned. But just why that's there, just an alternate name for this. I prefer to just call this spongy bone, just to keep with the types of tissues that we're interested in. Now, when we're talking about the skeleton, which we'll get to in a little while, one of the things that's important to think about are bone markings. In the chapter here, they introduce the concept of bone markings. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit more when I talk about the skeleton. But I want to point out this table here. And I'm actually going to give you a slightly bigger table or slightly longer table with more information in it, with a handout later on. But the idea is when we look at a bone, say this one right here, it has some weird bumps and stuff all over it. Those bumps are what we call bone markings. And because of the particular location and shape and size of the markings on this bone compared to the markings on this bone, we can tell these bones apart. And when we're learning the bones in the skeleton, the bone markings are going to be the clues that tell us what we're looking at, what bone we're seeing, and which side of the body it's on, that kind of thing. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get to the talk about the skeleton itself. Here's another picture of bone cells. I kind of went through this, but here's the 4 types that I just talked about. Little table talking about what they do to some degree. And then I talked about bone tissue when I was talking about connective tissues last time, but here in the bone chapter, it just highlights that a little bit more. Compact bone tissue is solid. Spongy bone tissue has little spaces throughout it. So this is compact bone tissue here, and this is spongy bone tissue here. And they're just little networks of bone spicules here. Bone is always arranged in layers of bone matrix called lamellae. A lamella means layer. So the plural of lamella is lamellae. For compact bone tissue, the primary shape that it's organized around, called an osteon, are rings of tissue, which I showed you last time. And then filling in the gaps between the very circular osteons are additional layers that aren't surrounding anything, they're just filler layers of tissue. And then the outside surface of the bone is surrounded by continuous layers that go all the way around the bone. The layers that are within an osteon are called concentric lamellae because they all have a single center, which is the center of the osteon. Filling in the spaces between osteons, the lamellae that are just in here, are called interstitial lamellae, and interstitial really just means in between space. And then the layers that surround the entire outside surface of the bone are called circumferential lamellae because they're running the circumference of the whole bone all the way around. In some places where there's a very, very thin layer of compact bone tissue, there might not really be a bunch of osteons. There might be a few small ones, but it mostly is going to be circumferential lamellae just running around the outside of the bone. With some of the natural bones that we have, there's holes in the side because circumferential lamellae are so thin. Grubby little A and P fingers playing with the bones over decades wear it down quite a bit. So you'll see some bones that the spongy bone underneath is exposed because the very thin layers of bone on the outside have actually broken down. For a long bone, what we're looking at here is basically a little chunk of the diaphysis wall. On the inside surface of the diaphysis, it sort of becomes spongy bone that then drops off and gives rise to the cavity in the middle. But the inside surface of a long bone is going to have a little bit of spongy bone there in the middle. But if we look at spongy bone a little bit more closely, and here they're suggesting we're looking in the epiphysis metaphysis kind of tissue there. It's made up of a bunch of little tubular structures of bone tissue with big gaps between them. And the space between these pieces of bone is largely going to be filled with bone marrow. If we look at one of these things in cross-section, this is actually kind of the picture we were looking at earlier. It's surrounded by osteoblasts. This picture has a couple of osteoclasts in it. And then the layers of bone matrix making up its width have osteocytes worked in between layers of matrix there. While bone tissue across the board is organized into lamellae, spongy bone tissue is just kind of random lamellae making up the cross-sectional structure that we see here. Compact bone is highly organized with the lamellae in these osteon structures for the concentric lamellae or the circumferential lamellae around the whole thing, or lamellae that are filling in the spaces, interstitial lamellae. So compact bone is highly, highly organized lamellae of bone. Spongy bone is still organized into layers. It's just the layers are just kind of all over the place. And if the bone has to grow a little bit bigger, it just puts another layer on the outside. If it needs to resorb some of the tissue and release calcium, then it'll just break down the outer layer of tissue and they'll get small. So it's kind of haphazard how the lamellae are laid out here, but that's the basic structure of spongy bone. Bone tissue is living tissue. It has a very rich blood supply because all of those cell types need blood. Osteocytes, osteoblasts, et cetera. They all need blood supply getting them nutrients and carrying waste products away. If the picture here kind of suggests if we could just isolate out the bone, the blood vessels in the bone, we'd see a really rich blood supply there. There's also a fairly rich nerve supply too. Some of the worst pain you can experience is bone pain. So if you break a bone, it really hurts because there's nerves running all through the tissue, which are usually protected by the hard bone matrix of the tissue. But if you break the bone, then that hard bone matrix is going to damage or pinch a nerve, and it's very, very painful because it's sort of raw exposed nerves within that tissue. So that's sort of the structure of bones. What I want to stress to some extent is just the idea of how the bones grow, how the skeleton comes into being to begin with. The process of bone growth is referred to often with the term, which is down at the bottom, of ossification. Kind of sounds like what you say to the state trooper if you've been drunk and you pulled over. Yes, ossification. But ossification is just the Latin word that means bone growth. Os is the Latin root for bone, and then ification just is the Latin construction that is defining the process of building bone. The Greek equivalent to that is osteogenesis, which the osteogenic cell is basically named for. So this is just the idea of how the bones develop, how the skeleton's made. There's really two different ways that the skeleton forms. And the two processes are intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. I thought I'd be able to fit them both on the same screen, but intramembranous ossification is when bone develops directly out of embryonic connective tissue. What's the name for embryonic connective tissue? Mesenchyme. Right. So it's when mesenchyme directly becomes calcified bone. Okay. That happens in a very specific set of bones. It happens in the bones of the skull, mostly the cranial bones, and the clavicles. Clavicles are your shoulder bone, your collarbones. Okay. They go from the head of the sternum out to your shoulders. What's important about the head and the shoulders? How many of you have had children? Now answer that question. And yes, that's the answer I'm looking for. What's important about head and
To
shoulders?
develop in their embryos?
Sorry?
You trying to say to develop in their embryos?
Um,
Or that they're soft?
well, I'm getting more at the childbirth part of
They're
it.
able to spread through.
That's the hardest part to pass through the birth canal. Okay. I don't know if this is actually true. I've never done the legwork to verify it, but it makes perfect sense to me, so I'm going to use it as my explanation. And intramembranous ossification usually leaves bones a little soft at the time of birth. And so those bones that need to be soft at the time of birth are going to develop through intramembranous ossification. The rest of the bones are going to develop through endochondral ossification. And chondro is the root that means cartilage. So endochondral means this is bone that develops from cartilage. Now, cartilage develops from mesenchyme, but we don't really care about that at this point. Instead, the idea here is the fetal skeleton, with the exception of the skull and the clavicles, is made out of cartilage. And then it calcifies into bone tissue through this process. Now, the four pictures at the top there are kind of suggesting how intramembranous ossification takes place. What looks like kind of a frying pan with eggs in it there, at the top. Let me make this bigger. Okay. So this thing here looks like a bunch of eggs being fried. These are osteoblasts within an ossification center, this blue area here. I really wish these pictures would go back just a little bit further. Okay. So before this ossification center ever existed, all that we would see in this area is mesenchyme. And for this picture, what we see outside of the blue area, this is still mesenchyme. So a cell in this area, a mesenchymal cell, which is what we call these things here, differentiated, changed, started to become an osteoblast, or I guess technically osteogenic cell. And it started secreting the proteins to make bone matrix to calcify the tissue. It divided into two cells, and those two cells divided into 4, 4A, et cetera, et cetera. And we get a little population of bone cells growing in this ossification center. Some of those cells end up staying behind in the ossification center, and the matrix calcifies around them. Okay. And so these cells here, these are osteocytes, which are what these osteoblasts end up becoming when the matrix grows around them. Other osteoblasts are on the outside edge of the ossification center and lay down more and more bone matrix and divide and make more and more osteoblasts so that the tissue will grow out. Now, this is happening in a very random progression, and so the tissue just ends up taking on a very spongy kind of appearance. Okay. Blood vessels will grow into this and sort of work their way through all of the gaps in the spongy tissue. And there will always be a layer of osteoblasts on the outside of the cell, on the outside of the tissue, which are the cellular part of the periosteum. And then the mesenchyme beyond that will also form directly into the dense, irregular connective tissue of the periosteum. And that'll become the mature flat bone of the cranium. That's intramembranous growth. Endochondral ossification is when we start with a cartilage bone shape that then calcifies. Now, in this series of pictures, they're showing how a long bone goes through this process. So in the middle of the long bone, what's going to end up being the diaphysis, the same sort of thing happens. An ossification center forms in the middle of that. It grows out, becomes very spongy bone, and then as it gets to the outside edges, kind of organizes into the compact bone wall of the diaphysis. The center of the ossification center ends up kind of hollowing out and blood vessels grow in, and we get the mature structure of the diaphysis there. And then in the epiphysis, a secondary ossification center grows in there, and the same sort of thing happens there, except that it never develops a hollow cavity in the middle. It just becomes spongy bone through and through. Now, the metaphysis doesn't develop separately. Metaphysis is just the division or the transition between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. In this picture, they're showing one end of the bone, the other end of the bone, the exact same thing's happening. Okay, so both epiphyses develop the same way at the same time. Where the diaphysis starts to grow, we call this the primary ossification center. In the epiphyses, this is called a secondary ossification center. And there's another secondary ossification center in the other epiphysis. Between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, there's always, or not always, there's going to remain a thin little cartilage streak right there, which is going to be called the epiphyseal plate, or more often, the growth plate. After birth, so before birth, the fetal skeleton is mostly calcified, except for the ones that go through intramembranous growth. And then after birth, that growth plate, or epiphyseal plate, will start to undergo growth, and the bones will get longer. Okay, so an infant ends up growing to full size through that process. Of course, that process takes a very long time. Some bones aren't done growing until somebody's 15 or more years old. But it's the little bit of cartilage in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis where that growth takes place. And the bone just keeps getting longer, really because the epiphyses grow out from the diaphysis in either direction, which is what's depicted here. Now, this is a kind of weird picture, but it does make a good point of what's going on in that growth plate. There's the cartilage, which is at the epiphyseal plate. At the edge of that cartilage, there's a bunch of cell division taking place in what we would call the proliferative zone. Cells proliferate. After they divide and we get a lot of cells, they then start to grow larger in a separate region. So these are small, quickly dividing cells. After they've divided, they start to get larger and larger, and we call that the hypertrophic zone, although it's not labeled that. It just says maturation and hypertrophy, which means cells getting bigger. And then eventually those cells, once they're full grown, are going to degenerate away as the tissue starts to calcify. And osteoblasts will grow into that area and help support that, and some of them will become osteocytes. As a bunch of cells are dividing and they're growing bigger, that's going to make that growth plate get thicker and thicker. Okay? And that's how the bone actually grows longer at either side. And then that thicker and thicker growing part of the cartilage calcifies. And so while it's growing thicker and thicker, it calcifies behind it, and it just keeps growing out on either side, getting to be a longer and longer bone. So this is probably the best picture I've seen depicting this, but I don't know that they did a great job. I would have centered these two a little bit better. So here we have the epiphysis of the bone, and here we have the epiphysis. And the difference between the two is that the diaphysis is longer. As the growth plate extends out and it calcifies, where it calcifies, that becomes more and more of the diaphysis. The shaft of the bone just gets longer and longer as the epiphyses grow off in either direction. Another aspect of bone growth is when they grow in diameter. I wish the book had a picture of this. There's a YouTube video I want to show you in a second that depicts this, which is actually from another book, but it's a pretty good animation of it. In the book, they talk about bones growing in diameter, and then they talk about bones remodeling. Certainly, small bones get bigger through the process I'm about to show you, but the process continues on throughout life. And so really these two things aren't separate. It's just early growth of the bone in that sense. It's how the bone gets bigger, wider, thicker, whatever you want to say. But then throughout life, the bone is always going through remodeling processes. So they're kind of going, it's kind of all happening. Unfortunately, while they're talking about modeling and remodeling in these two paragraphs, they don't introduce a term that I think is most important. So let me go to the video here. And I'm going into the video content part of the website. And just scrolling down until you get past the chemical, biology, tissue, skin. And then here's a thing that's kind of an overview of the skeletal system. If you want to look at that, it's a pretty good video. And then this one here is showing how bones grow. I was under the impression that the title here gave you the name, but it didn't. So let me just write that that word down real quick. It's important to be familiar with it. This is what's called appositional growth. So I did not misspell that. It starts with an A, but otherwise it's the same word as oppositional. Now, to oppose has two different meanings depending on how you spell it. To oppose means to be physically against something. To oppose, spelling with an O, means to be sort of idealist. What's the word I'm looking for? I wanted to say idealistically opposed. I don't know if that quite means it, but say you're opposed to the idea of student fees going up. Okay, it's a metaphorical sense of being opposed to something. If you were opposed to the idea of student fees going up, you would have to be physically adjacent to it. Okay, appositional means next to in a physical sense. So appositional growth is
different direction.
Growth at the edge of the bone. This is what the book calls modeling and remodeling. Sort of. So let me play this little video here. I don't think it has any voiceover. It's just a 45-second little thing showing how this happens. So to begin with, this is the edge of the bone. So this is the periosteum, and there's a blood vessel on the outside surface that has branches that go down into the bone. What we're going to see... it does have voiceover. Let me start that over.
Bones grow through the process of appositional growth, the formation of new bone on the surface of older bone or cartilage. Osteoblasts beneath the periosteum lay down bone to form ridges around a blood vessel. The blood vessel lies in a groove between the ridges. The groove is transformed into a tunnel when the bone built on the adjacent ridges meets. The periosteum of the groove becomes the endosteum of the tunnel. Osteoblasts from the endosteum lay down bone to form a new concentric lamella. The production of additional concentric lamellae fills in the tunnel and completes the formation of a new osteon.
Yeah. So
That's just showing
on
bone ridges grow up around this blood vessel and eventually surround it completely. Now, they're labeling osteoblast here. That's actually an osteocyte. I think when that label first shows up, it's at the edge of the tissue. They just don't take the label away. But osteoblasts on the edge of the tissue lay down more matrix, and it grows around this. Eventually, come on, merging into one continuous piece of bone like that. And then the inner lining of that tunnel that's grown around the blood vessel will lay down concentric lamellae. Whoops.
the tunnel and completes the formation of a new osteon.
Like you said, completing the formation. Oh, I didn't like that. There. So those concentric lamellae that are made as the lining of the tunnel kind of grows in completes making some compact bone tissue. Okay. And the bone used to be sort of at this level, and it's grown out from there, and so now it's wider at that point. That's appositional growth. Now that's happening in both what the book refers to as modeling and remodeling. So modeling a bone is when it's initially growing. This kind of process is going to take place so that the bone grows in the shape that it needs to take on. And then throughout our life, these processes are always going on. Partly with the mineral storage thing, as we release calcium from bones, we break it down and we store calcium in bones, grows back up. So these processes are going on all the time, which is what we call remodeling. But when it's at the edge of the bone, it's taking place through appositional growth. Now, something that this little video here in the book doesn't address at all is what actually stimulates this in the remodeling process. The osteoblasts that are part of the periosteum are sensitive to mechanical stimuli, you could say. When something's pulling on the periosteum, and when I say something, I mean a tendon or a ligament, it'll stimulate the osteoblasts to grow. And so anywhere that there's a stress on the surface of a bone, the bone's going to grow thicker right there. And that's what we mean by bone markings. So when we look at this bone, it has a big bump right here. That bump formed because of the modeling, remodeling processes of appositional growth to become a big chunk of bone right there. And it grew right there because there's a tendon attached to this bone that puts stress on the bone. Okay. This is your thigh bone, and so the muscle that's attached right there is a postural muscle that keeps you able to stand upright. So there's a lot of tension on that point, and the bone grows very thick. And it's also going to be involved in the movements of walking and that sort of thing. So the way that this bone is used, it grew thicker right there because there's a muscle attached there. It didn't grow thicker right there. There's nothing attached to that point pulling on it necessarily. How different bones grow actually lends to the different types of bone markings that we see. Now these two bones that I grabbed out of the carts here are actually very similar bones. This is the femur, your thigh bone, and this is the humerus, your upper arm bone. They're very similar because they're both the upper segment of one of your limbs. Now, I'm not actually sure if this is true. I've never actually sat down and measured babies or anything like that. But I think the upper arm of a baby and the upper leg of a baby are about the same size because they've not tried to walk yet.
those two parts of the body aren't doing anything different for a newborn. When you start to grow and you start to put weight on your legs, the bone in your leg is going to be responding to a lot of different forces than the bone in your arm, and so they grow very different. Now, there are similarities between these because of the fact that they're very similar bones within the skeleton. They both have very round heads at their proximal end. Okay? So this is the hip joint, this is the shoulder joint. Those two joints move very similarly. They're balls and socket type joints. And then at the other end, they both have what I call scroll work, kind of a woodworking kind of suggestion. At the elbow joint of the arm, the bone kind of rolls around like this. For the knee joint, it kind of rolls around like that. Those two joints work like hinges for the most part. And so if you think about a hinge like this in the door, there's the hinge is sort of wrapped around a pin there. So this part of the bone acts as the pin, and then another bone wraps around it, and it's able to move like a hinge. Or for the knee, the two bones move around each other like that. Now the knee joint and the elbow joint are both kind of hinge-like, but the elbow joint's a real hinge. The knee joint's kind of specialized because of how it's evolved and why. But they're similar in structure because they do kind of similar things. Very different from a bunch of other joints that don't have at all the same kind of structure or attachments or anything like that. Okay. So it's with where bones are attached to tendons and ligaments and joints and all that sort of thing. These sorts of processes are responsible for how they grow. Okay. Which leads to just the idea of the bone markings. But before I go back to that, I just want to be sure I covered everything I wanted to here. Yeah, that's, I wanted to kind of stress the ideas of how bones grow. The next section of the book is about how fractures, broken bones, repair themselves, which is kind of related to bone growth, but also kind of related to the wound healing I mentioned earlier with the skin. And then there's a little bit about exercise and nutrition, and then how calcium homeostasis works and the hormones that regulate that. I would normally like to spend a little bit of time talking about that homeostasis stuff, but it's not on the test that you have next week. So I'm going to spend some time talking about bones now to finish out for the day. But you should pay attention to this section as well as the bone growth and the bone fracture and the bone structure stuff. All of that's going to be in the part 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments you have for this chapter. But first off, let me just go back to the bone structure part here. Oops, too far. Sorry, it wasn't as far down as I thought. But there's this table here of bone markings. And these are just names that are used to refer to a bunch of different types of structures. I've already used the word head before. Process is a very general term, which means really something sticking off of something else. And there are a number of different types of processes. Projections, condyles, protuberances, spines, tubercles, tuberosities, crests, et cetera, et cetera. These are all different types of things sticking off. When we're referred to something as just a process, it's usually a small sort of bump or spike on a bone. So I want to talk a little bit about bone markings and specific bones here. So let me hand this out, which is a list of the bones of the skeleton. And these are the things that you need to sort of use for study. Now, at the beginning of this, I said that the skeleton is organized into the axial and the appendicular components. So the front page is axial, specifically the skull, and then the back of that first piece of paper has the rest of the axial skeleton, which would be the vertebral column and the rib cage. And then the next page is the appendicular skeleton, which is the bones of the arms and legs, along with the skeleton, shoulder and hip structures. And then I added into this, the last piece of paper, front and back, is a more extensive table, kind of like this one in the book that's on the screen now, with bone marking. It's alphabetically organized, so it might be easier to use as a reference for what different terms mean. And it has a few other ones. There are a couple of things I think that got left out of this table here, which is why I went to this one online. Oh yeah, that's right. For example, one that got left off of the table in the book is trochanter, which is number 23 in what I handed out to you. And the reason I want to point that out is that the one bump I've been talking about so far is a trochanter. Now, really all trochanter means is really big bump. But on the femur, which is the thigh bone that I've been showing you here, there are really two bumps here. There's a big one and a little one. The big one's called the greater trochanter, and the little one's called the lesser trochanter. And those are just markings where there's a lot of stress applied to the bone because of muscle attachments. And so it grew very thick right there where those muscle attachments are. Another example of that sort of thing that's sort of subtle in looking at the bone, there's a bump on the edge of this bone right here. Now this is the upper arm bone, this is the humerus, and on the humerus, on the lateral side of the humerus, there's a little bump right here, which is kind of hard to see. It's not as obvious as a trochanter like this. It's called a tuberosity. Now, as far as which of these terms is used for any given bone marking, it kind of depends just on whoever named it originally. Tuberosity kind of translates to small bump. Some sources will call it a medium-sized bump, but that's not terribly important how big the bump is. This is just a tuberosity. This is specifically what's called a deltoid tuberosity. Now, it's called a deltoid tuberosity because a deltoid muscle is what attaches there. The deltoid muscle is this triangular muscle that goes over the shoulder right here. Okay. Delta is the Greek letter that looks like a triangle, so it's named for that triangular shape. It attaches to the bone right there. Okay. And the point where it attaches is the deltoid tuberosity. That bump grew because every time you lift your arm like this, there's going to be a little bit of tension put on the bone there. And until the bone is used to lifting a certain amount of weight, that'll stimulate the bone to grow a little bit thicker right there. And so you develop that tuberosity where the deltoid's attached. For most people, the deltoid tuberosity is probably pretty much established. Nothing's going to change much unless you change the way that you use your skeleton. So if you go to the gym and you start doing, workout on a butterfly machine like this to increase the size of your deltoids, that's also going to increase the size of the deltoid tuberosity. The amount of growth of the bone is microscopic, so you're not going to see that, whereas the amount of growth of the muscle tissue hopefully will be visible. So while people go to work out their muscles, they are in fact building bone mass a little bit too, just not at a level that's visible in change. It is technically happening. Now, for what I've given you here, like I said, the front page is the bones of the skull. On the back of that first page are the other axial bones. The vertebral column on this side and the rib cage or bony thorax on this side. And then the next page has the appendicular skeleton, which is probably more stuff, but it's easier to organize, so it's all on one page. One column is the arms and the other column is the legs. And the arms and the legs are analogous structures. So everything is lined up here with what in the upper limb corresponds to the same thing in the lower limb. So the pectoral girdle, which is what we call the bones of the shoulder, namely the clavicle and scapula, correspond to the pelvic girdle, which is the pelvic bone. It has three parts. They're not three separate bones, really. They're all fused together into one bone. But the two bones in the shoulder and the one bone of the pelvis are analogous structures. And then the humerus and the femur are analogous bones. Like I said earlier, the bone of the upper part of the limb. They look different, but they're from the same part of the limb. And then in the next section of the limb, you have two bones, the radius and ulna in the arm and the tibia and fibula in the leg. They are analogous to each other. The ulna and the tibia are very, very similar, and the radius and the fibula are similar. Now, one thing that makes the ulna and the tibia fibular, for example, is they are the bone that makes the joint with the upper limb bone. So at the knee joint, the bone that's making the connection to the femur is the tibia. The fibula is actually nowhere near the actual knee joint. It's not involved at all. For the elbow joint, the bone that actually wraps around this, like I called it, scroll work for the hinge joint, that's actually the ulna. Okay. Now, for the elbow joint, the radius is there. It's just not part of the joint. It's just along for the ride. But the actual movement of the upper arm against the lower arm is humerus to ulna. That's the joint. So the tibia and the ulna are the bones that make joints with the femur and humerus, respectively. So they line up together. And then the radius and the fibula are sort of the analogous bones also. Besides which ones are making the joints, also the position is important. Okay? So when we're looking at the arm, the ulna is medial and the radius is lateral. When we're looking at the leg, the tibia is medial and the fibula is lateral. So they have the same position, which is just another reason why they're lateral. And then the carpals and the tarsals are analogous. The carpals are the bones of the wrist and the tarsals are the bones of the ankle. And then there are metacarpals and metatarsals. The metacarpals would be the bones in your palm. The metatarsals are the bones that are the arch of your foot, sort of in the same structure. And then the fingers and the toes, which are all collectively referred to as digits, are made up of the same kinds of bones, which are collectively called phalanges. A phalanx is a singular for that type of bone. So multiple phalanxes is actually pluralized phalanges, which you don't usually hear the word phalanx by itself, although it does have something to do with army and military formations, if you ever heard phalanx in that context. That's what's going on. So that just lays out the appendicular structure. Now, we don't have a whole lot of time here today. So what I want to do with the rest of what little time we have here is to give you a chance to look at some of these bones. Okay? Now, if you have access to the internet right now, you can pull up the cases that I was pointing out before. Go ahead and look at those. For those of you that don't have that handy, I'm going to put the cases back up here. Got it.
I'm curious about that where we don't have to classify bones, right?
Right.
Well, can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Just because it seems like weird.
I'm never going to ask you a question of what type of bone is this.
Okay.
There's not going to be a question that involves you to classify something.
You just have to know like.
I introduced them because when we're talking about bones, we refer to the structure of long bones or those sorts of things.
Okay.
But it's just a framework for you to understand why we're talking about the femur or the skull or something like that. But the classification is not important. I thought I'd be able to pull that page back up real quick, but let me just go back there. Okay, so what I was going to say is if you have access to it and you can pull it up on your own device, that's great. But with the half hour or so that we have left, what I would strongly suggest you do is to look at these cases and look at the bones that are mentioned here. So I've highlighted the ones in case 3 that are mentioned. Case 4, it's kind of hard to highlight the same way. But with what I handed out to you, find those bones. And what I would suggest you do is look at those bones and look at the information you need to know. You need to recognize particular markings. For example, femur is not one of the ones listed here, but I got a femur right here. So for the bones that are mentioned in the case, it would be wise for you to look through these and make sure you know where these things are. So for the femur, for example, it points out the head and the neck of the femur. And then the fovea capitis, which is a little dot there. The greater and lesser trochanters, which I pointed out earlier, those sorts of things. So familiarize yourself with those bones, and I would strongly suggest you use the time we have today to look at the bones that are specifically about the cases here. So I've highlighted the case 3 stuff. Maybe I can get the rest of this on the screen. Yeah. There. So that's all of case 4. I can highlight one thing at a time. So that's the stuff from case 3. But if you don't have access to the internet with a device, I'll leave this up on the screen. You can read it off of here and find the bones that are mentioned specifically. I'll point them out real quick. Where'd it go? So it says that she's broken her wrist and her ankle. So obviously there are bones there that I pointed out a second ago. And then it says fractures at L1 and L2, which is referring to the lumbar region of the spinal column. You look at that stuff. I'll get back to this in a second. Let me back to the book for a brief second. In looking at the axial and appendicular skeleton part of the book, let me go into the axial. So it's broken down. It has a section on the skull, a vertebral column, thoracic cage. So if you're looking for the lumbar region of the spinal column, you can go here, and this just shows you where the spinal column is. This is what a vertebral bone generally looks like, regardless of what level it's at. And then just a mention of the intervertebral discs. And then here is showing the cervical region, which is the neck, the thoracic region, which is the thorax, or where the rib cage is, the lumbar region, which is lower back, and then the sacrum and coccyx, which are the tailbone part.
So you can look through this and see where the structures are, and it'll point out some features of the bone. You can use this as some reference to understand what the case is asking you to look at. Here we go. So I would suggest that you use this last half hour here to make sure you understand what you need to know about the bones you specifically mentioned in the case. You should look at a few other bones, some things that I've highlighted today. There are bone carts in the back there. Yesterday, a couple of my colleagues spent the day organizing these. They get very messed up over the course of the academic year. So what they've done is they've organized them so that they didn't quite do what I thought they would do here. A lot of irregular bones on the top, although not entirely. And then, oh, I see what you did. Okay. So the top two shells in any of these have natural bones, real bones, what are fragile. And then the bottom two have plastic bone models. And the very bottom is the lower limb. The second from the bottom is upper limb, so those are all plastic bones. And then for the natural bones, it looks like they have, lower and upper limb, and with the upper limb natural bones, they also have some axial bones here. The axial plastic bones are actually over here in so these are vertebral bones here and ribs here, and the skulls are up here. You want to look at plastic bones. But if you're getting stuff off the cart, which you're welcome to do, be sure you put them back where you got them from. Pay attention to which shelf you're taking bones from, and put them back there. Just in the interest of time, I think this is the best use of your time, is to give you some chance to look at those bones. And I want to highlight that pay most attention to those bones, because most of the questions on next week's test are going to be directed at those bones. But you need to spend some time looking at other bones too. If you want more time to study, whether it's looking at bones or tissues or whatever, down the hall there's a room 511, which is not used for teaching. If you would like to stick around after class today, you can look at material down there. Any other day of the week, if you'd like to come in for additional study time, that room's available. We keep it locked, just ask somebody to open it up. We know what A&P students look like, usually like tremors and sweating and that kind of thing. So we'll open the door for you, you can study. You can come in anytime, 8 in the morning till 9 at night when we're teaching here. Not on the weekends, but, actually not on Friday, sorry. But you're welcome to come in if you want to study on your own, look at some lab material. It's all down the hall there. So make use of this time as you see fit. I'm available to answer any questions up front here if you want. And I'll leave that frozen up on the screen there. So.
Does it show which way the ribs are numbered on any of the things around here? I see ribs there.
Well, the rule of thumb for anything numbering is always going to be superior to inferior. So the first rib is here, the 12th rib is down here. Same thing with the vertebral bone. First cervical to 7th cervical, first lumbar to 5th lumbar. So,